Okay, greetings folks. Welcome back to the Australasian Symposium on Programmatic Approaches to Assessment. This is our last section 3C on faculty and school-based case studies. So I think, Thomas, you can keep going with the introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thanks for those. We still got 93 attendees. Fantastic. No one dropping off yet. So this, as Matthew said, is the last one on faculty school level. We're having first Hayley from the University of Melbourne for 20 minutes, including 5 minutes, and then Hora from University of New South Wales. As you can see on the slides, and once again, this is a new set of slides. You can just go and download that on the top of the slide to download the slides, but we'll also make them available later on. So, Hayley, are you ready to start your presentation? Okay.
Ready to rock and roll.
Cool. Yep.
Okay, hang on. Where is it? There it is. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce myself and start off by giving a bit of background about who I am. So I'm an education-focused academic teaching genetics and biology, and I'm currently involved in collaborative projects, as you can see listed on the slide, to understand the current assessment culture in STEM and where we can make inroads towards programmatic or program sort of level approaches to assessment, kind of lumping them all in together here. This work is in the analysis stage, so I won't be presenting any findings, but rather providing some insight into the challenges and possibilities for programmatic approaches in generalist science degrees. So I chose to include this recent quote because it reflects my approach to the adoption of educational innovations in general, and it's also particularly relevant to what I'm going to present today. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to read that. So rather than launching into why and how we should do program level approaches to assessment, I'm instead going to start off by clarifying the problem that we are trying to solve in science education and the key underlying issues. I'll then point to the current contextual factors which provide strategic leverage to support change, which, as we know, is often resisted. And finally, I'll provide possibilities for changing assessment to address the problem, which also resonate with the principles behind programmatic assessment. So, as with all good backwards learning design in education, we need to really start with the intended learning outcomes of the education we are providing. Way back in 2011, as part of a national learning and teaching academic standards project, a set of threshold learning outcomes were developed through extensive collaboration with STEM academics and was subsequently endorsed by the Australian Council of Deans of Science. And these have more recently been updated. They include 5 broad areas listed here: nature of science, scientific knowledge, inquiry and problem solving, communication, and personal and professional responsibility. A number of studies have since investigated the adoption and impact of these threshold learning outcomes on science education in Australia. This includes work by Susan Jones, Liz Johnson, and Joanne Calder, who looked at all of the publicly available program level outcomes for Bachelor of Science degrees in Australia and found that they all incorporated these threshold learning outcomes to one extent or another, which is why I like to include these TLOs. These learning outcomes also form the basis for the Science Student Skills Inventory, which is a quantitative survey tool designed to evaluate the perceptions of different skills aligned with the science TLOs from a number of perspectives. A number of studies have used this inventory over the past decade or more, and the particular results I'm presenting here is the work of Callie Matthews and Lucy Mercer-Mapstone, where they were considering the degree of convergence between academic and student perceptions of these skills. This is a subset of the data showing the perceived importance of the skill and the extent to which the skills are perceived to be included and assessed in the curriculum. As you can see, all of the skills were considered important to students to varying degrees, but teamwork and ethical thinking skills were less important to academics. Although this work was in 2018, and I would think that we might get a bit of a different result now, given the impact of Gen AI. Notably though, in terms of inclusion in the curriculum, almost all skills were perceived to be underrepresented relative to science content knowledge, and many skills were not well recognised in assessment. Secondly, the convergence between academics and students was only high for content knowledge. academics perceived less inclusion and less assessment of these skills than students do, and this is very likely due to the limited perspective of the curriculum as a whole by academics who are often siloed into a few specific units. It highlights two key problems which are particularly evident in general science degrees. The first is that even though there are 5 broad categories of learning outcomes, scientific content knowledge remains king. And secondly, there is lack of visibility of skill development and its assessment by both students and academics, suggesting either that these particular learning outcomes are not being well assessed, or they're not clearly evident when they are being assessed. One of the factors contributing to this problem can be found at the level of individual assessment tasks, which, to be fair, do often include a variety of different skills, as we can see here in these examples of typical STEM assessment tasks. However, there is a tendency for these skills to not be well showcased in how tasks are set, and this includes insufficient preparation to develop the particular skill or clarity on how skill competency will actually be evaluated. In many cases, many of these skills may not even be explicitly evaluated or count towards the mark, or at least not to the same extent as the correctness or accuracy of the scientific content knowledge. This is particularly the case of teamwork and collaboration, where the work produced by the group is often evaluated as opposed to the actual process of how the group collaborated or worked as a team. Additionally, even if rubrics capture how well students have demonstrated skills, such as the use of problem-solving strategies or the clarity of oral presentation, this information is often lost when a mark is given and subsequently aggregated across all of the other assessment results. This means that the development of skill competency is opaque to both students and staff. The second challenge is inherent to the way that generalist degree programs tend to be loosely structured. This is opposed to more defined specialist degree programs, which is what I've shown here. In this generic representation of a specialist degree program, there is a consistent core set of units that all students take, as well as some optional electives. Because the program of study is prescribed, it becomes much easier to scaffold the development of a particular skill-based outcome, such as shown here in pink. And actually, the developmental progression of a number of different skills-based outcomes becomes clearer because you can map them onto the pathway that students will take as they move through their degree. In contrast, this example of a generalist science degree program has a much looser structure, with any given major being specified by the completion of a combination of third-year core and elective units. When starting their degree, students have a larger amount of choice with the number of majors they have available. Just as a for instance, at my institute, there are currently 46 different majors available within the Bachelor of Science. Early unit choices by students normally need to consider the possible majors students may wish to take, so that they meet the relevant prerequisites for later year subjects. And these prerequisites ensure that students have sufficient background knowledge in the discipline area, and this again demonstrates the emphasis on scientific content knowledge. The flexibility afforded by the looser structure of generalist degrees comes at the expense of being able to map the developmental progression of other skill-based learning outcomes. With student choice of units often focused on discipline knowledge, the experience of skills supporting program level outcomes are more unpredictable. There's the risk that students will encounter some skills and not others, a bit like a scattergun approach. There can also be an oversaturation with many early units trying to cover numerous skills, sometimes superficially, to ensure students have been introduced to a variety of skills. However, because skill development, a skill assessment is not often explicit and is siloed within units, there's often little awareness of what's happening in other units running in parallel, or how the skill will be further developed in subsequent units. Here I have highlighted some of the implications of assessment and curriculum structures that support the predominance of scientific knowledge and the lack of visibility of skill development. While I'm not going to go into detail about each of these implications, they can be offset by the adoption of programmatic approaches to assessment, as you heard covered in earlier talks today. I do want to point out that my initial and sustained interest in program level approaches is driven by my desire for students to see the big picture and have more agency in their learning journey by seeing the relevance and connections between discrete learning experiences from day one all the way through to completion of their degree. While many of us, particularly those attending today, can see the benefits of program level approaches, I'm sure we're the first to recognise that their adoption is complex and challenging. I like this quote because it really emphasises the need to be aware of the situational context. This includes both the challenges and their silver linings, but also being agile in our approach in order to overcome pervasive resistance to change and well-established assessment cultures. While Gen AI is a huge disruptor, it is necessitating changes to assessment, particularly from an assurance of learning perspective. And in this context, a programmatic approach provides a big, juicy carrot, since at its core, it drives and captures student progression towards the demonstration of learning outcomes. Even with incentives for adopting programmatic approaches, we need to be mindful of how we bring others along on the journey so as to avoid a compliance mindset where implementation ends up being a tick box activity. To do this, we need to be considered and agile in our approach, understand and work with our current assessment ecosystems to progress change over time. With this in mind, I have a few possible suggestions for places that we might consider making changes, some a bit more drastic than others. So the first point is really considering how we structure these generalist degree programs. While generalist degrees are intended to be flexible, we can improve the visibility of pathways by incorporating units that are not only core to a particular major, but core to the degree, as well as units that are core to multiple majors. The latter could be units which focus on particular subsets of learning outcomes, with or without a disciplinary flavour. There are examples of these subjects currently at my institution, such as one that I've tried to demonstrate here in green, which focuses on the nature of science at a first year level, and at a second year level, subjects that focus on data analysis or communication. They're now being more purposefully integrated into majors. Another possible option where you do have sets of core subjects is synoptic assessment, which combines assessment across multiple units. This type of mapping or combination of core subunits actually provides the opportunity for more robustly mapping the developmental progression of program learning outcomes while still providing students flexibility for choosing their major until mid-degree. The remaining approaches focus on mechanisms to ensure we are actually evaluating and monitoring the developmental progression of learning outcomes. This includes signposting how different assessment tasks are actually assessing different program learning outcomes and the level of competency that students are required to demonstrate at different stages of their degree. This then needs to be evaluated and reported back to the student in terms of how well they have demonstrated the learning outcome at the expected level within the bounds of the task. This is less about providing a grade or a mark and more about evidencing levels of competency and, importantly, providing feedback for further improvement or towards this program level outcome. I don't particularly see that this would be overly challenging to implement at the task level within units. And while valuable for student learning in the short term, it becomes incredibly more meaningful once this information is collated in the bigger picture of all their assessment across their degree. Compiling information about student competency and feedback across units and over time provides a higher level perspective of their progression towards program level outcomes. This would essentially be some kind of portfolio or dashboard, and such things have been mentioned and discussed today in the chat. How this information is then used can vary in terms of whether it is only visible to the student, their teaching staff, or perhaps a formal mentor or advisor supporting them on their learning journey. The value being that it makes feedback more powerful when the dots can be connected and allows for reflection and identification of areas where more support may be needed. There are two other considerations that I want to quickly raise, but which I warn might make the horse bolt. The first is the potential to use information on student performance against PLOs at the task level for progression or program level decisions. I recognise that this is par for the course in cases where programmatic assessment is fully adopted. However, this is still a little bit of a stretch in generalist degree programs. This information, once captured, can be used in place of or in addition to marks, the power being that it has the potential to support assurance of learning by not only ensuring that there is a focus on the program level outcomes, but it could also be possible to indicate which assessments have been completed in secure settings and those which are less secure. Another possibility is that tracking information on student progression towards program level outcomes may enable options for choose your own adventure assessments. This may be particularly useful for supporting students with particular learning needs or where there is an observed imbalance in the assessment of particular program level outcomes based on the units they've chosen to study. The key with these approaches is that it provides visibility to both staff and students to support decisions on how students are assessed and progress through their program. The focus then shifts from individual tasks to the learning journey, supporting not only student achievement and outcomes, but their sense of agency and in turn engagement with their learning. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you, Hayley, for the presentation. Very interesting. Do we have any questions? Priya, you had one here.
Yeah, and there was another one before me.
Before you? Let me have a look.
Let me just say, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Nick had a comment there about programs at Griffith that map accreditation requirements. Yeah, Nick, that's more of a comment,
yeah,
right?
I was just stating that, you know, Hayley was saying making it more visible. And I know in some cases, some programs are putting the accredited requirements in the rubric so students can see what they're being assessed on and where it aligns. And then also others are actually explicitly just aligning to program learning outcomes as well. So great work, Hayley. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think from what I've noticed about through interviews with a lot of academics, it definitely is in there, but it's more just captured at a third year level. Yeah. I think that that's where the accreditation is really, you know, are they able to show this by the end of their degree? And I think there's a lot less sort of developmental progression and mapping of how students work towards those across their degree.
Exactly.
Yeah, Hayley, brilliant thinking, Hayley. And I think that's the key issue with the generalist degrees, isn't it? That how do you capture that longitudinality when students are using multiple courses within different schools, within a faculty? So I was just wondering to hear your thoughts on what do you think is the scope of some kind of an inter-faculty based, say, a repository of good assessment and activity suite. For example, student in, say, biochemistry would be taking some content from some courses from physics, some from chemistry, but some of the skills, and the ones I think in your table you had some important skills like teamwork, scientific ethos, attitude towards science and things like that, are generic to all the students of science. So to what extent there is a scope for some kind of an inter-faculty, kind of a skills passport?
Yeah, we do have some subjects even now. Like we have a discovery subject in first year level, but I've even through the interviews, there's a lot of other universities that have tried having more skills-based subjects that science students take. But when they're teached at first year level and they don't have a bit of a disciplinary flavour, they can often feel out of place to students, and they go like, why are we doing this? It doesn't seem relevant. And so I think that those subjects are important, and there's no reason to, move away from them. In fact, we could incorporate more to give us this structure, but it needs to be clearly signposted as to what the students are learning now that will set them up later, how it will relate to later assessments. And I think the current lack of visibility that students have, that this might be relevant to them later in their degree, or where it's actually going to be relevant and how they use the feedback, is really that missed opportunity to sort of, set them on their learning journey that they can then, self-direct a little bit as well, but, use that feedback, and inform their future learning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hayley. So we move on to the next one. Thomas?
Thank you. Thanks, Hayley. I'll send you a question personally about the feedback. Better utilized. I actually understood that, in a different way. But we move on to the next session, which is Hora. Are you all set up? You have the microphone. Okay, all working. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Hora.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending your Friday afternoon in this session. I'm Hora Hedayati, and my academic journey has spanned a shift from the dominance of quantitative methods in educational assessment to the rise of qualitative and mixed methods, again, in the space of educational assessments. And through it all, one concept has consistently intrigued me, and that was validity, and how we use evidence to support or challenge the claims we are making through assessment. In recent years, we've seen an increased interest in more complex assessment models, especially at program level in Australia. And I say in Australia because we are all aware that programmatic assessment is nothing new. It has been around for at least for the last 20 years, starting in medical sciences, and language assessment has a longer history of that because of its political status. So this is more about Australia that I made that comment. You can see this shift in university-led reforms that we heard about today, and the growing number of conference presentations. And an example of that was HERDSA, that this year we had more papers on programmatic assessment. And interestingly, there were more topics, paper presentation on programmatic assessment in HERDSA than the ones that we had in assessment in higher education. That was interesting for me. And of course, in today's symposium, we see that there's been a change or an interest here. This hasn't happened in isolation. It's been in response to concerns raised by students about the assessments, academics, academic leadership, employers, and even the governments. Two disruptions in particular have brought these concerns into sharp focus. The rise of AI tools and their availability, and the risk that they have posed to academic integrity, and also the emergency assessment practices we had to adopt during COVID. Now, what's at stake here? Why now? Because the role of assessment is assurance of learning. It is not the tool that we are using for an assessment, that it is an administrative tool that we use. It is a component that we have to have in our programs, but it is the heart of assurance of learning. It shapes the judgment we make about students' progress, their readiness for graduation, their learning journey. Those judgments carry weight because they signal whether a graduate is truly prepared. And that's where validity comes in, not just as a technical concept, but as a foundation for trust. Now, before we go further, I would like to ask you, I say that everyone is very active in the chat. I would like to ask you to put in the chat, in a few words, what does assessment validity mean to you? Maybe we spend a couple of minutes on that. That we are measuring what we intend to measure, that a task or activity teaches and assesses what it aims to, authentic expression of the learning of the students. I like them. Assessment validity means that the task actually says what it intends to intended to assess. Inferences. What inferences about the students' progress and our teaching, measuring what matters and what we think it does. Okay, I like these terms coming up, and these are reminders of some of the words that we heard today in the different presentations. I remember hearing, yes, validity, valid, it measures what it says it measures, inferences, trustworthiness, I think Stuart used that. We heard the word integrity, inferences, interpretation, and warrants. Worth doing and worth doing well. Perfect, thank you. Thanks for engaging with this. So, broadly speaking, there are two perspectives. One says validity is about the tool itself. It's about the assessment task itself. And it usually comes, is an assessment valid? And as you put it out there, does this assessment measures what it claims to measure? And the other one takes a wider lens. It asks whether the interpretations, decisions, and consequences, in bracket, inferences, we are making based on assessment results are justified for the intended purpose. In other words, the first one is that, is this tool valid? And the second one is asking, are our decisions defensible? Rather than looking at these two types of definition as two different opposing camps, what we actually see is an evolution in thinking. Over the time, validity has expanded, moving from a narrow tool focus, which is it measuring what it says it would measure, which is about the assessment tool itself. In the old days, test developers would come and say that my test is valid. It was the test is valid. But it has changed towards the end of 20th century, starting with Mesic, and there were others in Europe as well that were looking into that one and changing that thinking, that moved to broader concerns with how the results are used. And they came up with this theoretical definition, as Mesic put it, that integrated evaluative judgment of the degree to which theory and evidence support the interpretation of assessment results for the proposed use. So Mesic was good with theory. Yes, he had practical experience as well, but when it came to communicating that, okay, how can we collect that type of evidence? It was left to his students and the ones following after him. I would assume that from the discussions that I've had with colleagues here, many people are familiar with interpretive argument that Kane introduced that was focusing on these inferences. It was followed by the work that Beckman and Palmer did with the introduction of assessment use argument, which we'll dig into a little bit today. And a few years ago, integrated arguments was introduced by Shalop-Devil and O'Sullivan. A disclaimer here, the last two groups of people I referred to are coming from language assessments, and this is where I come from. This is my educational background. So my engagement with assessment started both as a student, that I love taking tests. It started in language assessment, sitting for different tests because I wanted to see where I sit, how I'm progressing in my journey, my learning journey, and then as a student and an academic later. So these people are from language programs, but what they have introduced, assessment use argument, integrated argument, are being used in other areas. And actually, I've read a couple of recent papers I've seen that are using assessment use argument in their work. Now, let's pause for a moment and think this together. Given the current landscape of assessment in higher education in Australia, we have lots of interest from different parties in our assessments. Which view of this validity, assessment validity, is being called upon? Is it validity is about the assessment, or validity is about the appropriateness of the interpretation and adequacy of the interpretation and judgments that we use and that we make for particular use? Anyone wants to put a response there? Yeah, I would assume that Dawson would talk more about MESIC. So if we are, and the things that we've heard today in the discussion, that both are important, but it's just a kind of how it has evolved. Something that we need to consider, what MESIC said, what Kane, Bachman and Palmer, and Shalop-Devil and O'Sullivan talk about. They are not forgetting about that validity is about this. That's, it's, are we measuring what we are saying we are measuring? But they are expanding it. They say that if we are measuring what we say we are measuring, then the decisions that we make are valid. And are they valid or not? Can we provide some evidence to support that it is valid, those judgments are right? Now, at the end of the day, assessment is about making judgments. We make judgments. Have the students learned? Are they progressing? Are they ready to graduate? And I think the interest that comes from our stakeholders, external ones in particular, is more at that higher level. The degree that you're awarding to students, is it valid? Whenever there is a decision being made, there are stakeholders. Someone is being judged. Someone is making the judgment. Someone is using that judgment. That's why clear justification, fairness, and accountability are coming into the picture. Now, assessment use argument, the one that Bachman and Palmer introduced. I like this diagram that they have in their book, and it is being used widely in different parts of the world. It's looking at why are we assessing. The first stage is that the student's performance on a task. Based on that, we give them a result. We give them a mark. Can it be a score, competency description? Based on that record or assessment result, we are making our first inference. We are making interpretations. The students has demonstrated a certain ability. Now we are looking at CLOs, PLOs. Based on that, a decision is being made. Okay, so if they have made these achievements and they have learned, they have acquired these abilities, they can graduate from our program. Perfect. So a decision of graduating or not graduating is made at that level. Another level of inference is involved, and that's what we call consequences. And some of them are intended, some of them are actually happening. They were unintended, but they keep happening. And that's when we say, when we decide that they get the degree, anyone looking at that degree says that, okay, this graduate is ready to integrate well into the job market. or pursue their higher education studies. So you see that there are two different arrows here. There are lots of arrows here. Some of them are showing that based on those results, we go making inferences, and that's where the idea of interpretation, inferences, and use of assessment comes into play. But this framework has another view as well. It says when you are going to design or develop an assessment, you don't start from your own course. We start, okay, so what is the consequences that we want to achieve? What decisions need to be made? What are if our students get a good mark in our assessments, what does it show? What should be my records or results? Are they going to be in the form of scores, competency descriptions? And then we go to the designing of the assessment. And this is something that in the last project that I work with the business school at UNSW, I try to incorporate this type of thinking in consultation with the associate dean for education in the master programs in the business. We started looking at these elements that, okay, so what is the consequence that we are looking at, that our students are going to graduate, go get jobs in these areas. And then from that higher level and within the UNSW's assessment, program level assessment approach to assessment, we started putting together a framework for implementing that framework into the course, into the program Master of Commerce. Now, and why I am putting assessment use argument as why I'm proposing it is that it is anchored in consequences. We are not designing assessment just to produce a score. We are designing them to support decision making and taking actions. And those actions have consequences. To me, that's the beauty of AUA. Another element about it is that it is flexible and dynamic. You can create it based on your context. And it is not very rigid that, oh, you have to do it like this. You come up with your claims, you go find areas to support, evidence to support it, and evidence to deal with the counter arguments that are being put forward, and then you work through that one. So it's not like rigid, and it's not a kind of a checklist that we tick them so we are done. So it is more like a kind of a guiding framework. Now, so what are the building blocks in assessment use argument? I should say I've been a little bit cheeky here. Again, this is coming from Beckman and Palmer, but I put it in a kind of the easiest way to look at it. You know, it's very, just what you need to have is to think about the claims that you are making based on that assessment. What is the claim that you're making? We are saying the consequences are beneficial. That's the part that is a bit tricky. Beneficial for whom? All of the stakeholders that are involved, from students, academics, university leadership, future employers, TEXA, our regulator, those are stakeholders. And when we are saying that program level assessment is beneficial, what are those benefits for these people? And what evidence are we going to provide? So we need to come up with our claims, and beautifully it is looking at 4 areas. The claims about consequences are beneficial, claims are value sensitive and equitable. That's where the discussion about fairness, about bias comes into play. Interpretations are meaningful, impartial, generalizable, relevant, sufficient. This is where that initial definition that we talked about, that does it assess what it says it is assessing, comes into play. And assessment records are consistent. It's going into the heart of reliability in the old days that we talked about, and how we are keeping records. Now, So this is an example of how we try to come up with, how we try to implement AUA in business school for Master of Commerce, to say that, okay, if you want to go around and collect evidence when we go to the program level approach, what are the claims that we need to talk about? So we started writing down what are the claims that are being made. And I'm just showing an element of it here. It was a very long list. I think I came up with 53 claims that are being made based on the discussions that we have in the faculty, the discussions that we hear from the higher level, that what claims are being made. And I heard today that we were also making some claims in the discussion today, which was nice. So it's a kind of, I'm just showing that how it could be done, and I'm happy to share any pieces of this information with you and anyone who's interested. And just some closing remarks. I know I just have 1 more minute. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one question. In a time when trust in assessment is being tested, could the assessment use argument help us rebuild that trust? Program level assessment offers universities a rare chance, a blank slate, to design assessment systems that are transparent, defensible, and meaningful. Program level assessment, as we heard today in a number of discussions, in a number of presentations and the chats that were going on, it is not necessarily guaranteeing that our assessments are going to be, all the problems, all the vulnerabilities we had in our assessments are going to be gone if we implement program level approach to assessment, but it gives us that opportunity to do things differently. It offers AUA framework, offers a clear and structured way to design, a guide to design PLA with purpose and clarity. It helps us justify the claims and the counterclaims we make based on PLA. And it helps us because if our regulators come and ask, we don't have to go and look for things to give them. These things will be there. And also it can serve as a built-in quality assurance process for programs. Thank you very much for engaging. Sorry, I'm very bad at multitasking, so I will go through the chat and comment on anything that is being said. But if there are any questions, Thomas, happy to answer them.
Thanks, Hora, for the presentation. And yes, it's tricky to keep at the same time an eye on the chats. There's lots of discussions going on, Hora, and I wasn't really bad. I was bad with the time. You're the last one, but not the least presentation. So thanks very much. I mean, at a long day. And are there any questions for Hora? The chat seems to be discussion about the validity still. You caused some stirred something up there. Hora, any questions?
Thomas, there was it Sean who said a really interesting question there. And he said, are we still talking about validity here? So that's very interesting, because it seems like this is a very fundamental shift in how we have been viewing validity. Hora, any thoughts there?
Yeah, of course. Look, yeah. So I think the first time that maybe Priya and I started talking about this was in that programmatic assessment working group that we were part of. And I think it was in one of the last meetings that we had that we came up with this idea came up that we also need to look into validity. Because at the time, what we were hearing from people about validity was just this kind of a narrow scope of validity. And that does it measure what it says it is measuring. And yes, this is a fundamental part of validity, but it's not the only one. It's not the area that we look at. Actually, in US, I'm aware that because they have these standards for educational assessment, and every 10 years it is being, renewed. And the last one that is already available, because now they are working on the new version coming out. The one that was published in 2014, they were already looking at the definition that MESIC and the areas that Kane introduced for collecting evidence. Not only that whether it measures, it was more about the interpretation and use of the test scores. So yes, we are talking about validity, and it is more about that trustworthiness. Are the decisions that we are making trustworthy? I hope I answered the question.
Thanks, Hora, you did. There's a question by Sue. Sue, do you want to read out your question?
So, hold on. Yeah, I'm still on. Question, Sue. So,
Sue has an active microphone, so she can talk herself.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Alex. Yeah, Sue. You've got the microphone now.
Sue has just dropped off, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. But I think the question was around, do we need to be consistently applying appropriate decision or grade or judgment, whatever, or what is the point of it at all? I honestly don't understand the question, but maybe Hora, you can go back to the chat.
Yeah, I will definitely go back through the chats and look at the comments.
I've got audio now, if that helps. We were just talking about, there was I'm trying to find the slide. There was a slide where you had the way you were talking about validity, and to the right with the 21st century, to me, it was starting to lean into reliability, that consistency of judgment. And then the conversation's just been progressing around in there. So because you need to have consistency of applying your judgment to an assessment task, right? Otherwise, I mean, like certainly I've run double-blind moderations on, for example, comms, and they go everything from a HD to a fail. There's like 70% variation. So how is that, like, do you know what I mean? Besides validity, you've got to have reliability in your evaluative judgment of your assessors, your markers, your grades, whatever you want to call them, of that task. So, and I think for me, we talk about validity a lot, but the idea or the notion of reliability does not come up in the dialogue very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Sue, for raising that. So something about, even in the earliest part of 20th century, when we were talking about the validity and saying that, and I should say that when I started my undergrad, during my whole undergrad, validity and reliability were two different topics. We were still talking about validity is about whether a test measures what it is. It says it is measuring. It was looking into content validity, criterion validity, and then, by the time that it became much bigger, it became construct validity. And even at that time, it was that if a test assessment is not reliable, it is not valid. So for a test, for an assessment to be valid, it had to be reliable. In this view that MESIC started, and there was someone else in UK, we started talking. We are talking about also in this part when we say assessment records are consistent. This is the part that we are talking about reliability, inter-rater reliability, intra-rater reliability, internal reliability within your assessment. So reliability is covered here, if it makes sense. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I was just typing. So thank you for situating that. Yeah, it's I guess from my perspective, we always tend to think of it as that you can't have reliability without validity, but you can have validity without reliability. So it's, but no, that's thank you for situating.
It's the other way around. Something can be reliable, but it is not valid.
Sorry.
But if something is valid, it has to be reliable. Not reliable, not very valid.
Thank you for that. That really gives me something to think about. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Good discussion here. Yeah.
Can I just say something about the question Leanne put here? It's about, disappeared. Saying, does validity end up equaling what the majority of educators think is appropriate? Not necessarily, because educators are only one set of stakeholders. We have students, we have educators, and that's when you are defining these consequences are beneficial or decisions are beneficial, you would think about all of these stakeholders. Educators are one group of stakeholders. We have this HERDSA, which is our key stakeholder and policy maker, actually, which is a kind of, at times, it could be in the US, the same thing is happening. The policymaker is regulator, and they see it as a kind of contradictory because they are the main users actually of this the test. So I'm afraid it's not that what only educators think is appropriate, and we definitely need to have evidence for everything. But that plays a role. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew and Thomas, and sorry I went over time.
All good, thanks, Hora. Okay, that sort of leaves us with just, concluding session. Really, we just go, it should be on the slide. We just have sort of a wrap-up discussion and, asking for key points from student. Matthew, do you want to run this? Or let me see, where's the slide?
Sure, yeah. We've got a bit of a fighting of the slides here. And I've been typing into the text chat as well. So the idea of this sort of closing session, which we called open discussion, I guess, we've kind of been doing that, is to get your reflections. So you guys hopefully have been here for most of the day, and we're going to use the text chat because unfortunately other tools are not available at this point. So the first one I'd like to get your reflections on as attendees and presenters, etc. What are the key takeaways and learning that you've got from today? If there was one sort of big thing that jumps out at you and says, "Oh, this is my big lesson for today," what would that be? It doesn't necessarily need to be the most recent one either. So if you can have a little think and type it into the text chat, that would be great. Of course, we will capture all this text chat, so it'll be kind of useful. If you're looking for the text chat, bottom right-hand corner, find the purple handle, go into the bubble icon, and then you should be able to access the text chat. As for accessing the history of the text chat, if you have moved out and moved back in, it does blank off. We will be publishing all of the text chat along with the recordings on the Transforming Assessment website. So you'll be able to download text files there. We'll also have videos of these sessions on our YouTube channels, at the HERDSA YouTube channel and the Transforming Assessment YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch videos with slideshows there. But the text chat files themselves, if you want to go back and look for questions or look for links and things, they'll be all on the Transforming Assessment webpage. I will set up a web page for the symposium there with all the recordings, etc. I'm just going to read down. Got lots of, yes, wicked problems. I think, Leanne, you're right about that. What I think we've learned is, of course, that the whole business of higher education assessment and all the rest of it is one big, massive, wicked problem. Years ago, I did a PhD in complex wicked systems problem thinking stuff, and this whole endeavor smacks of a complex wicked problem. Who was it recently that Dawson and co recently put out a paper about the wicked problem nature of assessment. It's probably worth reading. Go and have a look at that paper. I think things like, ideas like systems thinking is an area of theory and practice worth following up, because it provides a lot of tools that we can use to think about and satisfy wicked problems. Wicked problems are never solved. They are merely satisficed. So, as I sort of mentioned in the text chat a little bit while ago, there's this, I guess, a concept between problems that are merely complex with lots and lots of details that can be optimized, and problems that are truly wicked that defy solutions, which is a quote from the systems thinking literature somewhere that I've forgotten about. Michelle Padlow, takeaway for today: there are varied interpretations of what programmatic assessment means. Oh yes, I definitely agree with that one. Everybody seems to have a different view. Once you get into the field of things like e-portfolios, you discover that everybody has got a different view of what a portfolio should be, what it means to them, and what it means to their discipline. So I think it's going to be really a challenge for us to, I mean, I don't know if we're ever able to nail down the definitions of these things. We have problems defining what assessment tasks, what is an essay, what is a report, what is a quiz. Some universities, I know Macquarie University had a sort of a glossary, if you will, and that described, 40 or 50 different assessment tasks with a description next to them. And when you were doing your unit outline, unit definition, you had to pick which one you wanted. And I did an audit of that whole system, and I remember seeing a whole lot of very, very different interpretations. When you read what the academic wrote next to the label that they'd picked from the list, you could tell that there was very, very different definitions. So we're still battling that. Key takeaway from Adol: course coordinator ensuring their assessment types appropriately to the programmatic assessment methods. Yes. Oh yes, good point, Edward. The Australian Tertiary Education Commission. It is going to be an interesting thing if yet another layer of bureaucracy is going to help us move forward or not. Possibly the new texter. Okay, thank you very much for that. Now let's move on to part 2, potential topics for 2026. If we were to run this event again next year, what are the sorts of things you'd like to find out about? Have we opened a can of worms? Have we given you lots and lots of things to go away and get on with, or are there now more questions than answers? So. Oh yes, Thomas, you're right. The role of generative AI in this whole wicked problem mess. Well,
that could be a topic for next time.
Yes, but also Gen AI has been talked about in just about every other academic and assessment conference that I've been to in the last couple of years. So it's actually been nice to get a rest from the word Gen AI popping out in every presentation. In some respects, the disruptions from the pandemic and that move straight into generative AI coming up has really put a rocket under the idea of programmatic and program level and, those kind of approaches. I think that's been a real trigger. If it wasn't for the Gen AI arising, we may not even be here today. So, I get the, yes, Sue Higdon spelling right. You should see mine. My typing, it's terrible. Yeah, I mean, I think Gen AI has been a huge trigger for this stuff. Other people may disagree. I don't know, but yeah.
Absolutely agree, Matthew.
Yeah, Spice Wang, you've got a good point. It'll be nice to get some view from other countries. We deliberately labelled it as the Australasian because we'd hoped to get some people from New Zealand, but I don't think we quite got there. Maybe next year.
I was just wondering. Yeah, sorry, Hayley and Hora, if you're still there, you guys went to the UK assessment conference. Do you think it's worth having a chat with the UK colleagues? Because the system is similar, but I think they are moving towards some kind of an integrated assessment system, which is similar to our program level. What do you reckon?
I think they've struggled to make inroads. I don't know if you can hear me. Is my mic on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, I've got my computer mic, not my actual other mic. I think they've struggled to make inroads largely due to the modularity of their courses and the modular focus. I think the integrated program assessment has kind of maybe gotten a bit of traction in some places, like synoptic assessment, just because they can now, rather than having just teaching units, they can have assessment units as part of their regulatory framework. So they're sort of using that opportunity. But I think there's a bit of a general struggle. I think the conference did talk a lot about culture change. There was a lot around assessment cultures in that conference as well. That it's really hard to change things, and it's great to be at assessment conferences where you're talking about the changes that need to be made, but then you go back to your institute and you're not necessarily around colleagues that are all wanting to change. So I think that recognition that, there are some cultural constraints in assessment cultures.
And I had my hand up because I was going to say I was speaking to a couple of lovely ladies last week, Hazel McCafferty and Claire Hughes, and they were both at the University of Southampton, and they were interested in what was happening in our country. And so I know they're making some efforts at that university in some of their humanities and I think fashion design space. But also apparently there's some work happening in the University of Bristol as well. So, yeah.
I do reach out through the Assessment and Higher Education Network. Actually, as it happens, the webinar on the 1st of October is a joint effort with the Assessment and Higher Education Network based in the UK. So we could reach out and we could do a collaboration or specifically around programmatic approaches. I think actually the previous AHE joint session might have a bit on that. So I'd encourage people to go and have a look at the previous Transforming Assessment webinars. I think we did have one on that. So have a look at Priya, you wanted to talk, sorry?
Oh, no, I was just saying that the one that you did previously was with, I think you invited some people from Netherlands, didn't you? From Maastricht. Yeah, but yes, I think it's worth exploring something on program level, programmatic with UK and us, or maybe going Asia Pacific. I mean, that's another, because we did have some people from Malaysia joining today, but I think Indonesia, Singapore, they are doing pretty good, at least in healthcare.
Yeah, if we can get people willing to present, yes. I just popped a link into the text chat that was on the previous AHE joint session on programmatic approaches. So there's two presenters in that session. Yes, Altrich and who was the other one from King's in the UK. So they sort of skirted around the programmatic ideas a bit. I think my personal impression is we're actually a little bit more advanced. What looks like what people are doing in Australia at the moment, other than the roots of programmatic assessment proper in Europe, in the medical schools. They've sort of, it's obviously where it comes from. But yeah. Okay, so we are almost at 4 o'clock. So the last little bit of reminders are, yes, we would have the recordings online. If you could also please do our survey, I will email it out when I send out the reminder to. I'm going to send out this survey. Yep. Oh, thanks, Deanna. Yep, you're ahead of me. Thank you. That's sort of an experience survey, a brief experience survey, key lessons, key improvements, that kind of thing. And hopefully we'll be able to take action on that. Once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the presenters. It was fantastic. Everybody pretty much kept to time. You all did wonderful jobs for those of you still hanging around. And thanks for the 46 odd people still in the room. Recordings will be published soon.
Thanks to Matthew, Priya, Thomas, and Diana. It was a great effort and great initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to stress as well to all the presenters, if you're still all here, you were amazing. I was, as the German timekeeper, I had not to interfere at all. It just worked out really brilliantly. I was pleasantly surprised. It was fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.